even in this virtual way. And I am glad to share my book. It's really exciting to give book talks after the book is out in the world, because I can listen to your comments and your thoughts without having to think about like, oh, now I got to switch chapter 2 with chapter 6 and do all these modifications to the manuscript. I can actually digest comments and then think about using them in my work to come. So I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to share my screen to get the talk started. Okay, can you all see my PowerPoint? Yep, okay, great. I thought I would start off by giving a motivating example around the concept of legal passing from my field notes, and that's what I'll focus mostly on for the talk today. And so this example comes from a morning that I spent with Barbara. So from my notes, Barbara appeared suddenly in the kitchen just after 6:30 a.m. Her mother-in-law, Luz, had been playfully urging her to hurry and pulling together coffee and sandwiches because the pair had a long day of cleaning houses ahead of them. But when Barbara came into sight, Luz got quiet. Barbara was small. I noticed her hair was pulled back into a braid and that she wore an old pair of jeans, a t-shirt with the name of a church group from her hometown, and a pair of sandals. She had prepared and was ready for her first day of work in the United States. She had arrived several days earlier, following her husband, who was Luz's eldest son. But when Luz saw her, she said, "No, mija, we can't go out with you looking like that. The migra, or immigration enforcement, will see you from a mile away. Hurry now, pull on a nice shirt and clean shoes and fix up your hair, hurry." And in response, Barbara moved back down the hallway to change. And what I saw was, without a word, it seemed that she had taken in this initial lesson on life in her receiving locale, a Southern California city with a slew of restrictive immigration laws on the books and enacted in practices on the ground. And so it was in that morning in Luz's home that I started to think about undocumented immigrants' navigation of life in restrictive cities as a form of passing. And so it's this behavior that I want to focus on in the talk today. And so the book is trying to answer a puzzle. And so it should, I should emphasize that, of course, immigration status is a fully social and legal construction, and one that comes with very real and very tangible consequences. Scholars have come to consensus that holding undocumented immigration status is connected to systemic disadvantage and long-term or negative long-term and intergenerational consequences. Indeed, calling illegality as a new axis of stratification that reinforces existing forms of social inequality. And so given this, it's reasonable, I think, to expect that undocumented immigrants experience marginalization, especially those who live in destinations with an additional layer of restrictions on top of what is already enacted at the federal level. And this is probably especially true for immigrants who are racialized and seen as a threat. In many ways, what I've just said really advances popular media depictions of undocumented immigrant life in the shadows, represented here on the slide. With the curtains closed, really not engaging in everyday life. But we also know from the literature that the general consensus is that incorporation in its many realms remains the dominant empirical pattern among immigrant groups in the United States, including undocumented immigrants and people in mixed immigration status families. And we know that immigrants exert far more agency than the in the shadows narrative kind of prompts us to expect. And so, having set out this puzzle to try to untangle in the book, I'm really asking, in particular in this section around legal passing, how restrictive local immigration laws affect undocumented residents' everyday lives, and then how they affect their future trajectories. And the argument, you may have guessed by now, has to do with legal passing, which I'm describing as adaptation that continues in receiving locales with restrictive immigration laws on the books, and in fact, change that unfolds in ways that directly reflect the punitive nature of restrictive subnational immigration laws. So how does this happen? What I describe is legal passing is as a strategy that immigrants use to navigate daily life in unwelcoming destinations that is really a form of social camouflage, involving taking on the characteristics associated with the dominant majority to obscure legal status. And it's something that becomes internalized over time and incrementally and coercively contributes to cultural change. So I think a couple of points in terms of background before I delve into the study itself. We oftentimes think about immigration law and immigration enforcement at the federal level, though that's increasingly changing. And so we might ask ourselves, well, where do state and local immigration laws come in? And one, brief point I would make is that this is not a new phenomenon, that states and localities were practically the only source of immigration regulation until the 1870s. But if we fast forward through a bunch of really fascinating history to a more contemporary period, and I'll just say I'm calling contemporary mid-1990s forward, subnational immigration policies reemerged. And notable features of this more contemporary period cluster around, I think, at least three things. The first being crimmigration, or the convergence of civil immigration law, criminal law, and policing. The second being a focus on immigration status, especially undocumented immigration status. And that means, to the third point, that these laws are facially neutral. They don't explicitly target racial, ethnic, or national origins groups, as did past laws. These aren't a Chinese Exclusion Act or a Greaser Act that California passed in 1854, but despite being facially neutral and focused on documentation status, this contemporary set of subnational immigration laws do target an entire class of people. In the United States, Latin Americans generally, and in most parts of the US, people from Mexico in particular, who have non-criminal social characteristics, things like a language spoken or physical appearance that associate them in the public eye with a particular immigration status. And I threw up the example of Montana, or an incident that happened in Montana on this slide, just to illustrate this point, where two US citizens born in Texas and California respectively were speaking Spanish in a convenience store in Montana and were detained by the Border Patrol, who told them, and they caught on tape, thankfully, the reason I stopped you is because I came in here and saw that you guys are speaking Spanish, and that's unheard of up here. So unfortunately, no resource comprehensively tracks immigration legislation at the local level. Understandable, because we have so many localities in the US, though that would be a cool project for a grad student to take on. But we do have really good information from the NCSL on state level immigration laws that can give us a sense of scope, or how often are we seeing states step into the immigration law space. So the slide is showing you enacted immigration laws at the state level between 2005 and 2017. And you can see a tenfold increase in the total number of bills enacted by the states during this period. Clearly, if I showed you a slide that had immigration-related legislation introduced into state-level legislatures during this period, the bars would increase substantially. This is just measures that were enacted. And when you look at these laws kind of in a big scope way, it's fairly easy to sort them into two buckets. One bucket being restrictive local level laws, laws that attempt to reduce the rights and benefits available to immigrants, especially targeting people who are undocumented, and oftentimes with the underlying goal of making life so difficult that people kind of throw up their hands and leave, either to another US destination or really to the point of the attrition through enforcement doctrine here, to go back to their communities of origin. This is sort of the tightening of the screws of daily life, making it so difficult and uncomfortable and undergirded with threat that people leave. The second bucket is kind of on the polar opposite of the continuum here, which are laws that are intended to be accommodating, to expand rights and benefits of all immigrant residents, including those who are undocumented, oftentimes with the goal of further integrating them into the social fabric. And so you can see these kinds of restrictions and accommodations in force in really different ways across the country, prompting some scholars, Monica Barsani and others, to call this a multi-layered jurisdictional patchwork. And I really like the term patchwork because I think it captures the way that this looks on the ground. And this is just one example of the patchwork here on the slide that shows enacted county level policies on assisting immigration enforcement. You know, we could do this with other things like access to higher education, housing ordinances, driver's licenses, and the like. And you can see the legend of a policy continuum where red is jurisdictions that are spending substantial local time and resources on immigration enforcement, and the brightest green are jurisdictions that have comprehensive protections to prevent local resources and time to go towards immigration enforcement. So it probably won't surprise the folks on this Zoom call that California is the greenest spot on the map, but I will kind of unpack that a bit in a moment, because at the city level, also at the county level, there's considerable variation in local policy stances to undocumented residents throughout the state. Okay. So I also want to say a word about kind of where the literature lies in this area. And a lot of the literature looks at what the law is. Legal scholars are particularly all over this one around normative questions, whether and what laws should be, whether measures rightfully lie in federal or subnational policy territory. And then there's another group of literature, mostly from political scientists, that are looking at the direction of policies. So why do some cities pass restrictive laws while others pass accommodating ones? Why do some subnational localities not move in this direction much at all? And here we see questions around demographic change, partisanship, the presence and depth of immigrants serving nonprofit organizations, kind of being some of the driving factors for the directionality of policies. My concern lies more on the right-hand side of the slide, which is not with what the law is, but rather with what the law does. And so in this realm, some work is on the users of law, the role that non-immigrant actors, street-level bureaucrats, police officers, teachers, social workers, and the like play, and how they handle this new charge around immigration, be it restricting or accommodating. And drawing from that word, my focus is on the receivers of law, undocumented immigrant residents themselves, who confront the importance of their immigration status daily, and in particular do so in jurisdictions that have an additional layer of restrictions. This, I think, connects more directly to theories of assimilation. There's clearly major differences between classic and normative models of assimilation and more revised models. And what I'll say here is that I fall squarely around an interest on structure and the role of the context of reception in shaping immigrants' lives, in particular the social legal context of immigrants' destinations and how that shapes future trajectories moving forward. And I'm drawing a lot on the literature from passing in the book to make sense of this kind of adaptation here. And so passing, we know from Irving Goffman and our Sociology 101 courses way back when, happens when the minority group, a minority group, is oppressed or subject to discrimination and then reacts by trying to actively lose that stigma and become absorbed into a more powerful majority. So this is a proactive crossing of boundaries of highly stigmatized identities. And in the United States, due to our history of white supremacy and slavery, passing is typically associated with race, more particularly with Black Americans seeking to pass as white. And so in relating this concept and extending out this literature to undocumented immigrants, I'm looking at legal passing. But legality, of course, is an invisible trait. You can't know by looking at me today if I'm a US citizen by birth, if I'm a naturalized citizen, if I'm a green card holder. I might hold a variety of visas. I could have DACA, I could have TPS, maybe I'm undocumented. You might have some ideas about my immigration status based on the way I look, based on how I talk, based on where I work, and my position in society, but you can't truly know. Nonetheless, particular appearances are associated with legal status, and in fact, this is written into the black letter of the law through a 1975 Supreme Court case ruling that said that Border Patrol agents could use, quote, Mexican appearance when they decide whom to talk to or question, as long as that isn't the only factor. And so reasonable suspicion, for example, that a car contains undocumented immigrants includes, and I'm quoting again, mode of dress and haircut by which officers can recognize the appearance of persons who live in Mexico. So that might prompt the question, how does one hide such a Mexican appearance, to use the Supreme Court ruling's language, and pass? And here again, picking up concepts from Goffman, who I never thought I would, write a book with so much Goffman in it, but that happened. It's about a real careful and curated presentation of self. Things like your words, your gestures, and physical appearance that offer up cues about who we are and who we're not. And so for undocumented immigrants in restrictive locales, passing is a reactive and strategic effort to obscure that lack of immigration status in an environment with a heightened threat of deportation and everything that comes with that. Detention and family separation, to name just two. And over time, I argue, engaging in passing behaviors becomes internalized and contributes to change, but one change or an assimilation that is coercive, prompted by threat, and that pushes undocumented people to discipline and surveil themselves, their children, and others in the community. So the research comes from my dissertation work, which was just about a 2.5-year mixed method study, mostly cited in California, from 2012 through 2015. And California, as you all know, is a strategic research site for immigration work. In particular for this project, I argue because it has had consistently high levels of immigration since it became a state. A large population of undocumented people, especially people from Mexico, those who are frequently targeted by contemporary restrictions and accommodations, and a long-standing history of subnational immigration laws. And more particularly, I'm focusing on these two cities, Santa Ana and Escondido, who are only 70 miles away from each other, but have really different local immigration laws. And I'm guessing there's a possibility that some folks on the Zoom call might be very familiar with these places, or maybe even from these places. So I think you have probably more knowledge than I do about them, and I'd love to hear if I'm categorizing them correctly as I go forward. But what I'm trying to do here is leverage legal variation to develop a multi-sided and contrast-oriented comparison of undocumented immigrant life. So teasing out the effects of locality by selecting cities in one state, because we know state level laws vary a lot, selecting geographically close cities, selecting cities that are both working class, mid-sized inland communities near major cities, San Diego and LA respectively, and that are on average poorer and more racially and ethnically diverse than the more affluent coastal cities that they neighbor. But again, that vary quite a lot on immigration policy. I could probably talk for too long about all of the restrictions and accommodations that are in place in both of these cities. So I thought I would just try to highlight some of the most important here. Starting at the top with Escondido, which I put in red just to help your thinking that this is a more restrictive site. Escondido really made a name for itself in 2006 around immigration legislation at the local level by passing a restrictive housing ordinance for undocumented immigrants, making it difficult, if not impossible, to rent housing in the city that was based on the measure in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. But importantly, a lot of other things have happened in Escondido. One of which is that the police department has also worked very closely hand in glove with ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement, through a program they call Operation Joint Effort. Joint Effort stationed ICE officers at the Escondido Police Department, and this was a unique partnership across the United States established in 2010 that went far beyond the 287G program or the Secure Communities program. Now, Joint Effort ended in 2018. In fact, it was forced to end because of a state level law passed in California, SB 54, the Values Act, which mandated that law enforcement in California could not use resources for immigration enforcement. So the state forced Escondido's hand here. But by the time that Joint Effort ended and the 8-year reign that it had in the city, the program contributed to the deportation of close to 2,700 people, or a staggering 28 residents of this city a month. It's a powerful example of the discord between the state of California, which is moving in a more accommodating, progressive fashion as of late, and cities, which remain somewhat of a mixed bag of legal accommodations and restrictions. 13 cities across the state of California did not like SB 54, the Sanctuary Act in the state, and Escondido was included in that group. In fact, the mayor went to the White House for a Trump administration roundtable to speak out against sanctuary in California. But 35 California cities have supported variations of sanctuary of their own. And Santa Ana, which is the other city in the major city in the book, quoted here in green to prompt your thinking about being more accommodating or progressive here, is included in this group. And in fact, it has implemented a series of accommodating measures on a wide range of topics, moving from honoring consular ID cards as a form of ID before driver's licenses were again available to undocumented people in the state, policy to avoid impounding undocumented people's cars, and then finally in 2016, passing a sanctuary ordinance that had long been brewing in the city, and a sanctuary ordinance with some teeth to it, and also establishing a legal defense fund for undocumented immigrants who reside in Santa Ana and are detained by immigration enforcement. So I don't want to be too simplistic in the way that I paint these cities or paint them too broadly. But when I pair them together and look at them over time, I think that they do represent clearly contrasting socio-legal environments for undocumented immigrants. And so again, the question that's driving this sort of long wind-up here forward is how then do these local immigration laws affect undocumented residents' everyday lives, and then what is the connection between those effects and their future trajectories? I try to answer this question with interviews and observations, specifically 94 interviews with immigrant adults who are undocumented, all of whom are from Mexico across both field sites. And I tried to do this in a way that would select similar subjects across sites to isolate the effect of local policy as much as possible and add this analytical leverage to the study. I centered on undocumented people from Mexico because they're estimated to comprise the majority of undocumented population in both of these cities. And I'm glad to talk more about selection criteria if you all are interested. I also want to say that I did more interviews in Escondido than Santa Ana because my thinking about the effects of subnational immigration laws relies more on restricted cases. And today I'm going to use Santa Ana more as a contrast case to flesh out and check some of the arguments that I'll make about everyday life in Escondido. After the interviews, I did ethnographic shadowing observations. This wasn't part of the original plan. It was going to be an interview-based study. But as I came to this concept of legal passing in the work, I realized that some interactional data would be really useful and something that would allow me to actually see the navigation described to me in interviews in action. So I added that component to this study, though in a reduced role, not equal to the interviews. Okay, so I'm going to turn to the findings now. And I'll start with Escondido. So, you know, to engage in everyday activities in places like Escondido with a range of restrictive ordinances on the books and a police department that works hand in glove with ICE, the basic punchline here is that immigrants engage in legal passing, which involves this literal embodiment of the knowledge they accumulate about people in receiving locales on the front stage of their public personas. So, of course, looking American, as some people that I interviewed said, means different things to different people, and it can mean different things in different places. I have a piece out with a colleague that compares my work in California to her work in Montana, for example, which just looks very different given the population that lives in Montana versus those who live in Southern California, but involves a range of factors. And I think involves at least three primary clusters of behaviors. Behavioral adaptation, material adaptation, and mental adaptation, which is really about changing bodies, behaviors, and minds. So I want to give some representative examples of behavioral adaptation drawn from qualitative interviews. The first comes from Ramon, who is married with 3 kids and 38 when I interviewed him, and he emphasized the importance of a really calm presentation of self. He said, if I pull up to a traffic light and it turns out I have a police car next to me, I don't look over at them. I don't move my hands a lot or my eyes. I can't look nervous because they'll come after me. And it's a nervousness that they notice in people, and that's why you get stopped and ICE gets called. So an adjustment of body language, in the sense that I'm talking about in legal passing, I think goes beyond maintaining a calm demeanor, which is probably something a lot of us are familiar with when we're faced with interactions with authorities, police, or when you show your passport in an international destination and the like. In fact, it goes to a point that's made by Jaime, who is the next person I highlight on the slide here. For example, to actual physical gait or the way that one would walk through public space. So Jaime said, back home, maybe you're just taking a stroll, walking without any necessary purpose, or you're going to get something at the store, but you end up chatting with someone in the plaza. But here, people always have a reason for where they're going, and they want to get there fast. You can't just wander about in Escondido. It makes you look suspicious. And this was reiterated by another person I interviewed, Alfredo, who said, you have to act fearless, act American, and walk around the streets as if you were from here. And that was something that I asked Alfredo when I did later a shadowing observation with him. And in fact, we were walking down the street to a public park, and I remembered that I wanted to ask him about this. And so I said to him, you know, what does it mean to look fearless or to act fearless and look American? Like, what do you mean by that? And I'll tell on myself here because I wasn't really looking at him when I asked him that question. I was digging around in my bag for sunglasses. And he said, look at me, I'm doing it right now. And what he meant and what I saw him do when I turned my gaze to him was a really confident stride, shoulders back, looking straight ahead, not looking like he was confused or unsure about where he was going or who he was or his rightful place to be on that street walking towards the public park. And for him, that was a behavioral adaptation that he engaged in for purposes of legal passing. Legal passing also involves material adaptation. And so again, I'm going to present just a few examples from qualitative interviews. The first comes from Pedro, who was a single person, worked in construction, when I interviewed him, and he explained the importance of appearance as expressed through dress. Pedro said, you need to look presentable and well-dressed. If immigration or the police see you looking dirty, they'll pick you up. But if they see you looking nice, going to the store with clean shoes and everything, they'll say, okay, maybe this guy's from here. You know, shoes was a unexpected, repeated topic of conversation around legal passing. A lot of emphasis on not just clothes, but shoes. And you can see where class also interacts with activities around legal passing in that sense. Another example here comes from Lorena. Lorena was 48 when I interviewed her, and she's an outlier in the interview sample because Lorena herself is a green card holder. And I interviewed her in part because I didn't know that before we started the interview. I had some incorrect information about her. But our interview was really meaningful because she gave me another example of presentation of self through clothing by talking about her husband, who works as a landscaper. And Lorena was really worried about him looking unkempt and dirty after a long day at work outside in the sun. And so she pestered him quite a lot about this, and they finally came to a kind of a meeting of the minds about how they were going to handle, you know, what she understood to be a really high level of risk. And so she started to pack a change of clothes for him so that he wears khakis and a dress shirt rather than a dirty landscaping uniform on his commute home. And Lorena said, maybe it means nothing, but I think he calls less attention to himself with the clean clothes, looking like he's from here. Okay, so I've given some examples of behavioral adaptation, some examples of material adaptation or tangible things that we use in our everyday lives, like dress, clothes were also, or not clothes, cars were also a big one here. And on this point around mental adaptation, I want to suggest that alongside the sustained and material adaptation, sustained behavioral and material adaptation, comes some real changes in one's mind or the way they think about these things, where ways of navigating restrictive destinations start to feel normalized and routine. So one example here is from Alondra, who's a mom of two kids and who had lived in Escondido for 7 years. And she described her attempts to pass during everyday life, and then she took some time to kind of reflect on the meaning of this passing for her. And this particular moment for me really helped me understand mental adaptation. Alondra said, it's like putting on a seatbelt when you get into a car. And you know, I don't know how old everyone is in the Zoom call here, but there was a time when you didn't just put a seatbelt on as soon as you got into a car. But then, you know, we made laws and police started ticketing a lot. And so now when we get into cars, even ride shares and the like, probably most of us, the first thing we do is put on our seatbelt and we don't even think about it. But that was a learned behavior. And so Alondra says, it's like putting on a seatbelt when you get into a car. I don't think about it anymore, I just do it. It was funny telling you about it because I've gotten so used to doing these things that I don't think about them. Acting American has kind of become part of who I am. And another example of this comes from Pancho. So Pancho is Lorena's husband. Lorena from the previous slide that was the green card holder, who packs a change of clothes for him to wear home from his landscaping job. And so I was able to interview Pancho through my connection with Lorena. And I asked him a lot about what that practice meant to him. And he said, when we talked about this, at first he talked about the efficacy of it. Like, does this make police stop me less? And I think that's a hard question to answer with an interview and observational-based study, but definitely something that could happen perhaps with a, well, actually, I think that would probably be a really hard study to set up to answer that question. But he talked about that a lot, but then he took a moment to step back and reflect on how, regardless of the efficacy of it, it's actually become a routine that feels comfortable and almost a tender daily moment of exchange between him and his wife, that signifies for him that she cares for him, she's looking out for him, and that he cares for her and he'll do his best to be careful and will be home in the evening. So Pancho said, I don't know if it works. Does dressing this way keep the police from stopping me? I don't know. But I feel more comfortable and more confident driving home in these clothes because I look more like someone from here and I'm used to it now, and it's become part of our routine that I like, this daily exchange. So these examples, I think, show how both legal restrictions and adaptations that immigrants make to navigate, I should say that immigrants make adaptations to navigate legally restrictive receiving locales can become normalized and internalized, especially over time. So I could stop here, though, heads up, I'm not, I have a couple more things to say, but I could stop here and say, like, well, okay, so like so far, what are the lessons of legal passing? We might conclude that passing is not this full absorption of the dominant culture into the inner self. Maybe you might be thinking this is more similar to the concept of situational ethnicity or code switching, where we activate parts of ourselves depending on our perceptions of how relevant ethnicity or race is in a particular context. But what I'm claiming is something a little bit different. I'm claiming that legal passing has cumulative consequences that are unintended, but that incrementally force adaptation. And I'm saying that this is coercive because people are doing this in response to a set of laws that have a lot of control over both their everyday lives and their future trajectories. So it's not just a conscious moving back and forth between identities, but rather an internalized and a commonplace and normalized position that speaks to, I think, the literature on embodiment, or how practice leads to belief. There was a 17th century philosopher, I believe someone from what is today recognized as France, who said that there is a cure for atheism, right? Kneel and you shall believe. If you engage in the practice of prayer and praying and religiosity enough, you will become a religious person. And I'm drawing linkages between kind of that concept of practice leading to belief in this sense here around the internalization and normalization of legal passing. But that's just an assertion, so I have a couple of analysis checks that I want to talk with you about before I close. And so the analysis checks evolve in two different ways. So first, I ask whether passing continues when undocumented immigrants find themselves outside of Escondido for work or recreation. And then I turn to the case of Santa Ana and ask whether legal passing is central to navigation of daily life for undocumented residents there. And in this first check, I think the logic here, and asking whether passing continues when undocumented residents of Escondido leave that city for any purpose, the logic here is that if passing is only immediately related to restrictive environments within Escondido, then we would expect presentation of self to change once you're outside of city limits. Like maybe you can exhale once you leave Escondido and kind of let down that presentation of self. But what I show in the book is that passing has become this really ingrained and internalized behavior that carries over city lines and has become a practice that is part of oneself. An example of this comes from Julia, who said, for example, it doesn't matter, Julia works in cleaning homes, and she said, it doesn't matter if I'm cleaning houses in Del Mar, a rich city on the coast, close to Escondido, or buying groceries here in Escondido. I still fit in, I try to fit in and look like I'm from here, and I don't draw attention to myself. Maribel is 32 and said something similar. She said, I could be in Escondido or anywhere. I always dress this way so that no one thinks I don't have papers. It's become part of my style. And Maribel dressed in a very kind of typical Southern California style, like, you know, big hair, sunglasses, shorts, t-shirts, flip-flops, and sundresses. And this was something new to her. It's not the way she dressed at home prior to migration, but something that she felt like not only helped her fit in, but also kind of a style that she came to embrace as her own, that she kept regardless of wherever in Southern California she found herself. A second check is Santa Ana, the accommodating case, and I realize I haven't given a lot of time to this case, but the logic here in using the check in this sense is that if passing in Escondido and its related behavioral and material and mental adaptation is prompted by the restrictive legal context in place there, then we would expect to see a different navigation of daily life from undocumented residents of Santa Ana, which offers a more accommodating and welcoming socio-legal environment. And my fieldwork there confirms this somewhat. And so I should say, the argument is not that presentation of self is non-existent in Santa Ana. In fact, presentation of self and image management is, of course, present for undocumented immigrants and for literally everyone who's moving through the social world, right? We're all engaged in this process and this activity of presentation of self, this work. But in Santa Ana, that was manifest mostly in behavioral adaptations focused on appearing law-abiding to avoid fines and inconvenience, far less so to avoid deportation. And so these weren't, I don't think, attempts to pass or the same kinds of attempts to pass. And they didn't lead, as far as I could tell, to this kind of material and mental shifts that I've described for immigrants in Escondido. So let me give you some examples of what I mean by behavioral adaptation from inside Santa Ana. So the first comes from Javier. He had lived in Santa Ana for 6 years when I interviewed him. And he said, I act calm and not nervous when I'm driving. The police don't give us too many problems, but I don't have money to pay for tickets and I don't have a license. So you can see how this behavior, acting calm while you drive, looks similar to the behavior in Escondido around driving, but the motivation is really different here. It's avoiding tickets, avoiding fines, but not avoiding the threat of deportation that was so very present in daily life in Escondido. Another example comes from Ana, who worked in a warehouse in Santa Ana. When I asked her about her navigation of daily life, she said, I have family in other cities where, yes, they don't speak Spanish on the street and they dress in a certain way. In fact, she's got family in Phoenix, Arizona. But here in Santa Ana, there's no need for that. It's more relaxed here. The most you do is drive the speed limit and just stay calm. Okay, so to kind of pull out some implications from what I've just presented here, I think there are several things to talk about, but I'll focus just on a couple. In the book, I hope that an implication is a reevaluation of the unit of analysis that we use for international migration stuff. A lot is happening around immigration law and enforcement at the local level. And so taking a national level approach is limited, I think. And I think that legal contexts and climates within immediate destinations for immigrants matter deeply to their daily lives and future trajectories in a way that we maybe haven't quite appreciated yet. I'm also hoping that an implication of the book has to do with recasting the In the Shadows narrative that's been so ingrained, especially in media portrayals, but also some of the scholarship, where we see the rich social world of immigrants, including people who lack authorization status, kind of reduced into a flat caricature that takes away the agency of immigrants. Because what I'm trying to show in the book is that legal passing, this navigation of everyday life, requires a lot of effort, requires a lot of money, requires a lot of mental expenditures and ingenuity. And so understanding immigrants' agency with this navigation highlights the way that undocumented immigrant life is endured over time and its harsh impacts on well-being, which is similar, I think, to some of the weathering literature in public health studies. And this kind of concept of endurance is what I'm moving forward with in a new book project. And then finally, I think that this project pushes us to think about rethinking law in relation to assimilation and well-being. So scholarship on immigrant assimilation, we could say a lot of things about it, but one of the things I want to say is that it doesn't often consider the effects of law at all. And that legal passing shows how subnational legal restrictions drive changes related to assimilation by threat and force and coercion, and that negatively impacts well-being or whether immigrants are better or worse off over time. With an end result, I think, of reinforcing existing forms of social inequality and likely driving new ones. And so, although I've mostly focused on the restrictions today, I also wanted to say one thing about, maybe more than one thing, about the accommodating locale and sort of the implications there. Importantly, I think that states and localities with a range of accommodating immigration laws, there's no silver bullet here. Localities, to this point in our national history, cannot change one's immigration status or fully ameliorate exclusions and enforcement at the local level. And you know, even impacts of local level immigration laws are limited. Sanctuary ordinances can't get rid of the complex tensions between immigrants, especially racialized immigrants, and the police, for example. But I think in a comparative perspective, we can see that a socio-legal context of accommodation and welcome helps send important messages that contribute to immigrants' sense of membership and their well-being, let alone you know, a research that shows that deportations are down in sanctuary cities because of those kinds of protections. So both kind of a membership effect and then a tangible effect around actual physical presence in a place with a community and with a family. And so I think with that, I'll stop and thank you so much for, again, the invitation, and I'm looking forward to hearing questions. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen now so I can see all of you a little bit better.
Yeah, so thank you for the presentation. We have about like 20 minutes for questions, so feel free to jump in.
I have a question. Can I ask my question? I tried to raise my hand, but I'll lower my hand right now. So yeah, so that was a really interesting. And as you were speaking, I kept on thinking of the work of Yasmin Soysal, and particularly her concept of, you know, post-national citizenship, and her argument that your legal status doesn't really matter anymore because your human rights is recognized, right? And that unless you commit a crime, you're not going to be really picked on by authorities. And so, so I kept on thinking of how then, so my larger question is, well, how is this work engaging, you know, this sort of argument that has sort of caused like a very adverse reaction among senior immigration scholars. I remember I was having lunch with Michael Correa-Jones, and the name of Yasmin Soysal came up, and he just ranted for 20 minutes about everything that's wrong about that argument. But I do see, like, you know, her argument resonate a little bit in your work here. So that's the first question, is how then would you respond to this sort of dismissal of her work? So how is, you know, your work perhaps making us revisit her argument that many immigration scholars reject? And then the second thing is, how does human rights in general play a role in the experiences of the migrants you're looking at?
Thank you for the question. Both really good ones. So I think I'll maybe take the second question first around human rights. I thought a lot about this, especially in the conclusion of the book, because I think it's a natural place to kind of land. And what I'd say is that I think that my data points to the importance of subnational jurisdictions, cities, and states, counties, in doing some of this protective work around human rights that we expect nation states to do, and that we might expect, you know, supranational structures to do for us as well. But we've seen grave failures in that regard that I don't have to, you know, recite for you all, but that localities can actually have a really important role to play here, and pushing back and mediating against violations of human rights at the federal level. And I think in ways that sometimes we don't fully appreciate, that oftentimes we say are just symbolic, or, hand waving or pearl clutching, when cities make declarations in support of DACA or in support of ending immigrant detention, we might say, just a symbolic gesture. But I actually think that those symbolic gestures cumulatively both send messages to undocumented people within the locality, and also obviously send messages to the broader public. And sometimes those are the beginning stages or beginning percolations of a stronger kind of ordinance that might get on the books around sanctuary, and one that has some real teeth to it. And so on the point of human rights, I just say that I think that there's all is not lost. And if we're looking for a place to dig in, really focusing in on the local level might be the way to go at this current juncture in the United States. On the point of post-national citizenship, I mean, I think that a lot of people do reject that notion and sort of say, oh, that was just this really optimistic moment when we saw, the EU coming together, and we had this idea that we could be citizens of the world and share collectively in human rights. And what I'm trying to emphasize in the book is the ways that locality can matter for that sense of common membership and belonging. So even before we get to kind of the post-national, I think even the national is still in question with my book, because as we see, there's this patchwork of not just socio-legal context, but actual rights that are afforded to people, depending on whether or not you live, 2 miles this way or 2 miles that way. And I think that has a lot of implications for how we might think of life post-nationally. Because if we can't get it together even within a state, right, or even with the county, then we might want to think about how we could get it together in a post-national moment. In fact, I just got this book, I haven't read it yet, but there's this is not my book, I'm not product placement here. This is by Karthik Ramakrishnan and Alan Colburn, who are talking about a new framework for state rights, and if we could think about state level citizenship, not even post-national citizenship. So, I'm thinking much more micro, but I don't think, do you want me to hold it up? I don't think that I don't think that thinking post-national precludes thinking about citizenship or urban belonging at the more micro level sense. In fact, I kind of enjoy thinking about them both at once. Should I? Oh, I see hands are up. You can tell how good I am at Zoom teaching. Daisy, oh, nice to see you.
So nice to see you, Angelica. Thank you so much for, sorry, Angela. Sorry, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and delving into your work. I had questions of the implications of your argument that I just wanted to ask to see what you think. So a lot of the legal passing, the objective seemed to avoid deportation or interaction with law enforcement, how that could lead to interactions with ICE, detention, and deportation. But I also think that there might be some implications related to other forms of exclusion that are both institutional and interpersonal. I can imagine some legal passing strategies to avoid discrimination at institutional settings like education, or to avoid interpersonal mistreatment. Because the stigma management concept allows for this more wider net of strategies, right? They can happen in multiple spaces. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. Also, the research was focused on 2 localities, but I was also wondering about people who maybe live in one locality and work in another. Maybe they live in Santa Ana and work in a locality that is more, there's more immigration enforcement. Maybe there's more anti-immigrant sentiment at the societal level as well, or white supremacy anti-immigrant groups. So I was wondering how, like, maybe these transitions in everyday life between one setting and another can also affect legal passing strategies.
Thanks for your questions. Yeah, so I think you're right on the broader implications around how people interact with institutions, in particular around school, healthcare, politics and political involvement. And I think, the primary way I would answer that question is that in restrictive localities, it seems to me that due to deportation threat, there's kind of blinders up where everything is filtered through the threat of deportation, in the sense that even when we think about how people are understanding and involved in local politics, it's all focused and centered around immigration enforcement and what the police are doing and why are there these DUI checkpoints. And so it's not that people are checked out and not involved in local politics in this sense, but rather that it's all filtered through this real tangible deportation threat. Whereas in more accommodating locales, people can get involved and plugged into local politics. It's just, to use an example, in realms that may have to do with immigration or realms that may not have to do with immigration. And so in the book, I talk about a group of day laborers in Santa Ana who got really involved with the city around laboring, or around demanding for better access and more miles of bike lanes, protected bike lanes in the city, because they usually ride their bikes to the pickup site outside a big box construction store, and felt like it was a really dangerous thing for them to do. And that might sound small, but it's unimaginable for something like that to happen in a restrictive locale, like actually going to city council meetings and meeting with police officers and looking at maps and plotting out bike lanes. That kind of political involvement is not feasible in a place that has sort of the veil of deportation threat so deeply embedded through all of its institutions. So yeah, there are much more broader implications. On the point around travel between your place of residence and work, or even potentially school, that happened a lot. In fact, probably for most of the people that are in my study, they were, and you all know how Southern California is. You can see it's all sort of mushes together. For me, as an outsider, it mushes together. For the people that I was interviewing, they knew really clearly when they were in one jurisdiction or another. So I should say that too. And in Santa Ana, people talked a lot about Costa Mesa being a restrictive locale. Costa Mesa had some anti-day labor ordinances on the books, had Border Patrol in its jails at one point in the 1990s, but has since sort of de-escalated its anti-immigrant efforts, but it still has that reputation amongst undocumented people in Santa Ana that that's not a very friendly place to go. And so say that when people went there, like there was a swap meet that was set up there, they would kind of get in for what they need and get out. Or go to work. Then maybe they had some homes that they cleaned in Costa Mesa, but then would exit as soon as possible. And so I think in those situations, there was legal passing kinds of behaviors that were enacted in Costa Mesa, but that didn't give them, because they weren't kind of living and working and breathing in this space at all times. There was less of this, what I'm calling an internalization or mental adaptations around legal passing. It was more kind of situational in that regard. Josh, hey, congratulations on your new book.
Oh, thank you so much. This was an excellent presentation. I really liked it. Listening to you talk, I was kind of regretting that I'm not teaching like an introduction to sociology class or something, because you do a great job of connecting these micro processes to these macro circumstances. I think it'd be a really great book for an introduction to sociology, or a series of other classes, but that's how I would envision using it in teaching. I have two questions. They're both kind of obnoxious and annoying, so I apologize in advance. But the first question is kind of theory question, which is I want to know how seriously we should take Goffman as the kind of springboard for this project, because towards the end of your talk, you talked about this tension between the scholarship on embodiment and then the scholarship on code switching. And I thought that was really convincing. And then once I heard you say that, I thought, well, how much can Goffman really help us here? Because his presentation of self argument that he provides is so exhausting in terms of it being like it's always a conscious presentation of yourself. And you were talking about how this becomes embodiment. So I was thinking about the ways in which your concept of legal passing actually moves us beyond Goffman's notion of the presentation of self. And I was wondering you had any thoughts on that, if there were any other kind of theoretical inspirations for you. I mean, I was thinking, you know, even Du Bois on double consciousness might be relevant, something like Pierre Bourdieu on habitus and embodiment, which is rich literature and feminism on embodiment. And then I was also thinking, you know, even like Frantz Fanon and Black Skin, White Masks. And I was just wondering, why Goffman? Why is that the primary, you know, certainly it's reasonable to springboard from him, but why is that so relevant for your project? And then my other question, and you feel free not to answer this if you don't want to, because it's not really about your exact research question, but I was wondering, what would be the main explanations for these legal differences? Like, what are the, if you were to, you know, pinpoint it to like 3 or 4 major causes that explain these local variations, what would they be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, 2 really good questions. On the first, the theory question, you know, I'm glad that was your impression, because that's what I'm trying to convey in the book, is that, you know, presentation, and this is also sort of a time story. So it's a cross-sectional study. It's not a longitudinal study, but I do kind of use that leverage of the comparison case to offer some deeper insights into people's behavior over time. And so I think that the way that legal passing as a behavior sort of starts is through this Goffmanian idea of presentation of self, and you're really conscious that you're doing it, right? But then it moves into, and I like the reference to Du Bois and Fanon here, into something that becomes more embodied when you start doing it without thinking about it. But that doesn't happen, you know, your first week or your first month or even your first year. It's something that happens over practice and over time. And so, you know, a part of my thinking here came from Jennifer Carlson's book on gun carriers, and how, you know, carrying a gun changes the way that you think about yourself and move through the space, especially with gender kind of implications there. And that if you do that over time and you practice that over time, that it can actually change your own sense of self. And so that's what I was going for with Goffman, you know, driving the narrative, but taking an extended step beyond that. The question on why some cities restrict and why some cities accommodate is a really good one. There's a lot of work out there on this. The way that I talk about it in my book focuses really on 3 factors that other folks have done, and, you know, in more quantitative studies that look at demographic change. So restrictions are associated with sharp increases in foreign-born population, especially from Latin America. Partisanship. So you're not going to be surprised to know that restrictions are associated with Republican partisanship, kind of over time, deeply over time. And then finally, the role, and this one is somewhat less explored, I think, in the literature, the role of immigrant serving community-based organizations in kind of forming these or reacting to these restrictions. So you'll see in restricted places less in terms of numbers and in terms of strength and resources, community-based organizations that do work around immigrant and immigration advocacy. And on the flip side, in places that have more accommodations, you see way more of these organizations, because they are in fact partners with local politicians in forming and crafting accommodations. Like sanctuary ordinances don't, you know, the city councils don't get together and say, let's pass a sanctuary ordinance. They're reacting to pressure from activists and from community-based organizations. And that kind of pressure isn't present in restrictive locales by and large. And so when you look at the maps, for example, of where these community-based orgs are, and you can see glaring holes, it really makes you think about, you know, where to put your efforts, where to put your 2 cents if you are someone that cares about activism and community organizing, would be not in places like LA or San Francisco or Chicago, but in places like North Carolina, you know, the new immigrant destinations, Georgia, and the like, that have very few of these organizational resources. So that's the long answer to the second question. Karina, did you? Hey,
Hey.
how you
Yeah, I
doing?
have a question. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. We appreciated it, and I thought your presentation was fascinating, and I wish we had more time to hear more. My question had to do with going back to the literature on passing for Black folks that you mentioned. I know that passing refers to, like, it only benefits some, right? So I was wondering, what are the limitations to legal passing? How is it complicated by skin color and phenotypical features? Because I know that you mentioned that class, right, having the material clothes and shoes to present as American is helpful, but I was wondering about immigrants that perhaps were darker skinned or from indigenous communities who, no matter what they wore or how they walked, were still racialized as right racialized and seen as undocumented and perhaps more of a target for questioning. So just
Yeah.
kind of wondering about colorism there.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the first thing I should say that I didn't say earlier is that on the indigeneity question, I intentionally selected people that self-identified as mestizo and not indigenous for this study, in part because there are a lot of indigenous people, or relatively more indigenous people, that are living in and around Escondido than there are in Santa Ana. And I think for the reasons that you just pointed out, that it would make for a real apples to oranges comparison to look at the experiences of people who are indigenous to people who self-identify as mestizo. And in fact, the conditions that a lot of indigenous people live in and around Escondido and San Diego County, working in agriculture, are really rough conditions. And so when we talk about marginalization, these are, I think, some of the most marginalized folks in that area, kind of living next to agricultural fields where they're actually working, living in the canyons and the like. And so I thought that wasn't a real appropriate comparison. So having said that, that doesn't mean that there's no questions of colorism, phenotype, skin tone, even within the self-identified mestizo populations in both cities whatsoever. And I think that legal passing, as I've described it, wouldn't work and doesn't work in the same way for places that don't have large US-born Latinx populations. Because, for example, there's work from Iowa, there's work from Montana, around audibility, where just speaking Spanish, regardless of how you look, targets you as other and undocumented in some places, right? In a way that in a big city like LA or Chicago, it just wouldn't. And so I think that it is very much complicated by the person who's actively trying to do the legal passing, their phenotype, their skin tone, but it's also complicated by the broader population within that receiving locale and their race and ethnicity. So in a paper I wrote with Leah Schmalzweier, who does work in Montana, especially around gender and immigrant women, we sort of compared my findings of California with her findings in Montana, where people didn't really even actively try to engage in legal passing as I've described it to you folks today, because there's no point. Montana is one of the whitest states in the United States. And so, beyond sort of not raising suspicion or not, engaging in behaviors that might make people look at you twice, there's literally nothing that you can do about your brown body or your brown skin and the way it's perceived in a place that's majority white. Yeah, so I think that's how I hope that made sense. I thought there was one. Oh, Valentina?
Last question, Valentina.
Okay, I have the last question. Thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I had a question about the concept of incorporation itself that you mentioned at the very beginning as being the dominant empirical pattern. I think like also in some literature, and I'm thinking about Jeffrey Alexander modes of incorporation is still very much used to, you know, refer to processes of adaptation of immigrant or, you know, diversity in America. And so I'm thinking like what you think about the use of the concept itself and whether your work can somehow help us move beyond the concept of incorporation. If you're thinking, you know, there's some better analytical term or empirical pattern that your work is pointing towards that we can kind of think about in substitution of the concept of incorporation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that question. So this isn't like just my work at all, the way I'm going to respond to your question, but really drawing from, you know, the greats among us with immigration scholars. But what I hope that my work does is sort of try to piece apart what folks call assimilation or incorporation from well-being. And so well-being is where I want to hang my hat here. I think a lot of times we think about, you know, as immigrants become more incorporated, their well-being also increases. And one of the things that I'm pointing to in my book is that that's actually not necessarily the case. And in fact, the ways in which I'm pointing towards cultural change happening in the book, which might be called assimilation, is detrimental to well-being because it's coercive, because it's forced, because it's under threat. And so I'd love to see the literature move in a direction where we're not thinking about, you know, how do we, not exclusively thinking about how we see difference and all of its realm, from cultural to socioeconomic to educational attainment to residential segregation, like how we're seeing those differences decrease between immigrants and US born folks, but also around the idea of well-being. And if increasing assimilation means decreasing well-being, then I think that that's something really to grapple with as both scholars, but also as a set of public policy questions. Wow, you all asked really great questions. Thank you for engaging so much with the work. I really appreciate such an active audience. I know Zoom is exhausting, so thank you for sticking with me.
So thank you, Angela, for a wonderful talk. And now those of you that have scheduled one-on-one meetings, I ask that you please stay on the Zoom call.